Hi there, I'm Heidi Nord with the Brilliant Dyslexic, and this is our next sound juggling lesson. So the one thing I want to always remind you is don't think about the letters, just think about the sounds as we're going through this. So just block the letters out and process the sounds. So this first one is d, f, t, draft. And in draft, what if I take off the f? Then you have ot, dropped. Here's the next one. It is slint. And in slint, what happens if I take off the n? You have slit. The next one is slind. And in slind, what happens if I take off the o? You're left with sind. The next one is prompt. And in prompt, what happens if I take off the you're left with pont. This is tract. In tract, what happens if I take off the t? You're left with track. This is clothes. In clothes, what happens if I take off the k? You're left with loathes. This one is scold. In scold, what happens if I take off the s? You're left with cold. This next one is tramp. In tramp, what happens if I take off the You're left with tamp. Here is plump. In plump, what happens if I take off the You're left with plup. Here is plunge. In plunge, what if I take off the j? You're left with plun. Here is ground. In ground, what happens if I take off the You're left with gowned. Here is graft. In graft, what happens if I take off the g? You're left with raft. Here is grand. In grand, what happens if I take off the n? You're left with grad. Here is grant. In grant, what if I take off the t? You're left with gran. The next one is plank. In plank, what happens if I take off the k? You're left with playing. This one is plant. In plant, what happens if I take off the n? You're left with plant. plat. This one is g-r-a-s-p, grasp. In grasp, what happens if I take off the You're left with g-a-s-p, gasp. Here is p-r-a-n-k, prank. In prank, what happens if I take off the n? You're left with p-r-a-k, prank. Here is sk-a-l-p, scalp. In scalp, what happens if I take off the p? You're left with sk-a-l, scowl. This one is sk or ch-z, scorches. Actually, that doesn't work. Let's do sk or ch-t, scorched. So in scorched, what happens if I take off the k? You're left with scorched, sorched. So in quartz, quartz, what happens if I take off the k? You're left with w-or-t-s, warts. In b-r-a-n-z, bronze, what happens if I take off the You're left with b-a-n-z, bonds. And this one is f-r-a-n-t, front. In front, what if I take off the n? You're left with f-r-a-t, front. And this one is b-r-e-d, breadth. In breadth, what if I take off the th? You're left with b-r-e-d, bread. Here is f-r-a-s-t, frost. In frost, what if I take off the You're left with f-a-s-t, fost. And this is sp-a-n-j, sponge. In sponge, what if I take off the n? You're left with sp-a-j, spudge. Thank you so much for coming to this sound juggling lesson. I hope you all have a great day. Bye.